Ever since Spider Noir dropped all 8 episodes at once, Marvel fans are having an absolute field day by binging them all together, because really, what's better than watching Nicolas Cage as a private investigator by day and a reluctant hero by night? What Spider Noir manages to pull off in just 8 episodes is genuinely impressive. Despite juggling so many moving parts, the series never feels rushed or overcrowded, because every storyline is given room to breathe, while the show handles its fast pace with a surprising amount of confidence and style. Whether it's the long list of villains woven into the plot or the many charming side characters that get meaningful development, the finale does a great job of giving everyone their moment. So without wasting another minute, let's discuss what happens by the end of Spider Noir Season 1. Now, if you've already binged Spider Noir, then you know the series begins with Ben Reilly still haunted by a tragic loss from losing his wife all those years ago. Even though he wants nothing to do with the life he once lived as the Spider, the sudden rise of a group of superpowered criminals pulls him back into the world of crime fighting. By the end of the season, the story centers on Ben Reilly and Cat Hardy taking down Silvermane and his crew, which includes Flint Marko and Dirk Layton. But getting to that point naturally involved a tangled web of investigations and hidden agendas. Ben was first hired by a man named Winston to track down Jimmy Addison, a pyrokinetic mutant. Around the same time, another man named Carmody paid Ben to find Cat Hardy. Now the issue is that both these cases eventually led back to Silvermane. As it turns out, Hardy had once been Silvermane's muse, while Addison was responsible for burning down one of Silvermane's mansions. Now, the villain's larger goal in the show was to destroy Mayor Morris's re-election campaign and position himself as the new kingpin of New York City. To make that happen, he relied not only on manipulation tactics and political pressure, but also on building a powerful crew of mutants to serve as his enforcers, thus making him nearly untouchable. The origins of those mutants go back to World War I, when prisoners of the war like Marko, Layton, Addison, Lonnie Lincoln, and Ogden Faber were captured by German forces and subjected to experiments at a facility somewhere in France. Now, Reilly himself had served in World War I, and during the war, he helped rescue several prisoners from captivity. But in the process, he was bitten by the Man-Spider, which gave him extraordinary abilities and ultimately turned him into the Spider. The other POWs were changed as well, though their mutations slowly began killing them. Desperate to save her son, Ogden, a genetic scientist named Althea Faber, started searching for a cure by experimenting on the captured soldiers. Most of the test subjects died during the process, while the survivors only saw their mutations worsen, pushing them even closer to death. Eventually, Althea discovered that Reilly's blood could be used to create an antidote, but when Dirk Layton learned that her experiments had led to the deaths of so many POWs, he snapped and killed both Althea and Ogden. Now, amid all the chaos, Reilly escaped with the antidote. At that point, he was so exhausted by the burden of being the Spider that Reilly planned to use the antidote on himself and finally leave the life of crime fighting behind for good. However, his friend Robbie Robertson, a journalist at the Daily Bugle, convinced him that the city still needed a hero. That's why, instead of curing himself first, Reilly chose to help Lonnie Lincoln, who had already started questioning his role as a superpowered enforcer for villains. So Reilly used the antidote on him, freeing him from both his mutation and the criminal life that came with it. Now, after learning that the Spider had been present when Lonnie was cured, Silvermane finally started putting the pieces together in the Spider Noir finale. Since Ben Reilly was publicly known as the Spider's close friend, Silvermane assumed that anyone trying to reach the Spider, especially someone looking for the antidote, would have to go through Reilly first. That's why he sent Flint Marko, Dirk Layton, Pudge, and Perry to stake out Reilly's office and bring the detective to him. But even within Silvermane's crew, tensions were beginning to rise. Marko desperately wanted the antidote because he knew his powers were slowly killing him, and more than anything, he wanted a chance to become normal again and live a peaceful life with Cat Hardy. Layton, however, saw things very differently because unlike the others, he didn't feel weakened by his mutation. If anything, he believed his powers were making him stronger every day. While Marko tried warning him that he misunderstood how their mutations work, Layton had no interest in hearing it. By that point, his ambitions had grown far beyond simply working for Silvermane, and he wanted to take over the criminal underworld himself, and the first step toward that was removing Silvermane from the board entirely. Having said that, unlike mutants working under him, Silvermane didn't have any superpowers. What made him dangerous was the influence, authority, and the power he had built over the years. He only relied on mutants as his muscle because they followed his orders. But the moment they stopped respecting that authority and saw him as just another ordinary man, his entire empire could fall apart. Marco understood that distinction better than anyone. To him, Silvermane's real strength wasn't physical power, but the network, reputation, and fear he had cultivated over time. Marco knew that kind of influence couldn't simply be replaced by brute force or flashy abilities, and that's why he preferred staying loyal to Silvermane rather than betraying him. In his eyes, a man who could remain untouchable without powers had built something far more stable and dangerous than Layden realized. At the same time, Layden's point of view wasn't entirely wrong either. He understood that mutants like him were ultimately expendable to Silvermane, and Layden had no interest in risking his life forever for someone else's empire. He wanted power for himself. He wanted to be the one making decisions instead of taking orders. Because of those completely different mindsets, there was never any real chance that Marco and Layden would agree. In the end, they simply accepted that they saw the world differently and left it at that. On the other hand, Kat quietly listened as Silvermane laid out his ambitions and obsession with gaining more power. Afterward, she arranged a meeting with Riley's secretary, Janet, hoping she could pass a message along to him. The reason Kat couldn't approach Riley directly was fairly complicated. For one, Riley wasn't at his office and was hiding out at Robbie Robertson's place to recover from his brutal fight with Lonnie, which had happened shortly before Lonnie received the antidote. More importantly, Kat probably didn't feel ready to face him after what had happened between them. She had, in a way, betrayed Riley by handing him over to the Fabers. But from her perspective, it wasn't entirely out of malice. She believed that the only way to save Marco from dying because of his mutation was for the Fabers to study Riley and use his blood to perfect the antidote. On top of that, Riley himself had already admitted to Kat that he no longer wanted to be the Spider. He was exhausted by the responsibility and wanted an escape from the life of a superhero. Because of that, Kat convinced herself that what she was doing wasn't just about helping Marco, but also giving Riley the chance to finally walk away from being the Spider for good. Before Kat even had the chance to explain herself, Janet slapped her twice. But Kat didn't fight back or argue. She accepted it because deep down she knew she had hurt Riley and deserved Janet's anger. Once things calmed down, Kat tried to explain her side of the story. She claimed she wanted to help the good guys by getting the antidote to Marco and curing him, which would weaken Silvermane's crew from the inside. But it was clear her motivations were also personal. Despite her brief relationship with Riley and everything that had happened, Kat was still in love with Marco. She genuinely wanted to save him from his mutation so they could have a normal life together. The guilt she carried over her role in Jimmy Addison's death only made that desire stronger. After speaking with Kat, Janet stopped by the office, where she received a call from Officer Hank. He informed her that the city had issued a lookout for Riley and the mayor wanted to find him because he believed Riley could lead them to the Spider, and more importantly to the antidote that could stop the mutant enforcers sabotaging his re-election campaign. After realizing how serious the situation had become, Janet immediately headed to Robbie Robertson's house to warn Riley. But she didn't realize that she was being followed the entire time, and thus led Silvermane's men straight to Robbie's doorstep. While they were discussing the next move, Layden and Marco suddenly stormed into Robbie's house and dragged Riley away to meet Silvermane. Before they left, Robbie attempted to hand Riley his overcoat, which secretly contained the roll-up pouch holding the antidote syringes, but he wasn't able to get it to him in time, and that left Riley in a terrible position. Much like Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2, Riley's powers were closely tied to his physical and emotional condition. Since he was still badly hurt from his earlier fight with Lonnie, his organic web shooters had stopped working. This meant that without his webs and without the antidote, he was essentially walking into Silvermane's trap defenseless. Anyway, the meeting took place at the alcove, where Silvermane was waiting alongside Kat, Pudge, and Perry. Once Riley arrived, Silvermane ordered him to contact the Spider and bring him to the meeting, because as it turns out, Silvermane wasn't just after the antidote anymore. With one of his mutant enforcers already out of the picture, he was also considering recruiting the Spider into his operation. Riley tried to stall for as long as he could, but eventually he had no choice except to make the call out to Robbie, who played along perfectly, pretending to be the Spider over the phone and agreeing to come to the alcove with the antidote. As everyone waited for the Spider to arrive at the alcove, Layden suddenly remembered that Riley had been the soldier who rescued the mutated POWs back in France during World War I. That realization made Silvermane and the others start to connect the dots, leading them to suspect that Riley himself was actually the Spider. Naturally, Riley denied it, but Silvermane decided to test him anyway by giving him two choices. Either admit that he was the Spider and save Kat from being shot, or continue denying it while Kat gets killed. Of course, Silvermane didn't actually know about the complicated relationship between Riley and Kat. He simply assumed that if Riley was the Spider, he would risk everything to protect the only seemingly innocent person in the room. But what Silvermane also didn't realize was that his ultimatum put Marco in a difficult position too. Since Marco was secretly in love with Kat, he now had to save her and turn against Silvermane, or stay loyal and let her die. To make matters worse, Marco was the only person there who could realistically save Kat, as Riley's powers still weren't functioning properly because of his injuries, leaving him unable to act even if he wanted to reveal his identity. At that moment, the fate of everyone in the room rested almost entirely on Marco's decision. Naturally, Kat became convinced that Silvermane was about to kill her, so she finally decided to reveal the truth by admitting that she had been behind many of the problems Silvermane had been dealing with all along. She confessed to repeatedly trying to sabotage and even kill him, while secretly working with Mayor Morris to make sure Silvermane never gained control of the city. According to her, Silvermane was a dangerous man who deserved to lose both his influence and his grip on her life. And because neither Riley nor Marco seemed willing or able to act, Kat assumed she was out of time. If she was going to die, she at least wanted Silvermane to know that, despite everything, he had failed to recognize the traitor in his own circle until she chose to expose herself. Now, Silvermane was moments away from pulling the trigger when Robbie suddenly arrived dressed as the Spider. For a brief second, Riley was off the hook, but of course, Robbie was completely out of his depth. While wearing the mask seemed to give him a burst of confidence, and for a moment, he genuinely acted as though he had the upper hand against the dangerous criminal standing in front of him. Seeing Robbie get a little too confident in the spider costume, Riley had to bring him back to reality by reminding him that while anyone could wear the mask, simply putting it on didn't magically give someone the spider's powers. As Robbie settled down, Janet arrived carrying the roll-up pouch containing the antidote syringes. Layden immediately decided to test one of the syringes on the spider, and since Robbie was the one in the costume, everyone assumed that the antidote had stripped him of his powers. But instead of handing the remaining syringes over to Silvermane, Layden kept them for himself, because whoever controlled the antidote would control who got to keep their powers and who didn't. That kind of leverage meant real power, and Layden was finally ready to act on the ambitions he had previously discussed with Marco about overthrowing Silvermane. Sensing the growing betrayal, Silvermane quickly tried to pull Marco back to his side. He assured him that he never truly intended to kill Kat and convinced Marco to retrieve the syringes from Layden. With everyone turning on each other and tension spiraling out of control inside the alcove, Riley made one more attempt to use his powers, and this time they finally worked. When Silvermane tried to escape, Kat chased after him, and at the same time, the spider battled both Marco and Layden. Initially, both Kat and the spider struggled against their opponents, but the tide eventually turned as Kat shot and killed Silvermane, while the spider defeated Layden by hurling him into an overhead metro rail. During the fight, Layden went after Kat, and that pushed Marco to finally turn against him, though he was badly injured in the process. Since electricity can harden sand into fragile glass-like material, Layden's powers nearly destroyed him. Then, to save Marco's life, Riley used the final antidote syringe on him, and without his mutant abilities, Marco was finally able to heal normally. But with the antidote gone, Riley accepted that he would remain the spider for the rest of his life. Later, when Riley briefly met Kat at Silvermane's funeral, she confessed about still having feelings for him, but Riley chose not to give her another chance, refusing to risk being manipulated again. In the show's final moments, we see that Mayor Morris had won his second term. Janet and Frankie began rebuilding the office, and Robbie left the Daily Bugle to launch his own newspaper, the Harlem Herald. On top of everything else, the Silvermane case also changed Riley on a personal level. Over the course of the story, he learned the value of having people by his side, which is why he renamed his agency from B. Riley Private Investigator to Riley and Ruiz Private Investigators. It was a small change, but it showed how much he had opened himself up to companionship again. The ending also makes it clear that Riley's sense of responsibility had returned. Earlier in the series, he questioned the point of being a hero when he couldn't even save his wife Ruby, because losing her left him emotionally broken and disconnected from the idea of being the Spider. But after everything that happened, Riley realized there was still good in people worth protecting. Like most great Spider-Man stories, the ending ultimately comes down to responsibility, as Riley understands that having powers gives him the ability to help others, and not using them for good would make those gifts meaningless. As we see him use his web shooter to grab his hat before heading off on another case, it's clear that he's fully embraced being the Spider at the end. Well, that was quite the clean-cut ending. What are your thoughts on Spider Noir? Let us know in the comments down below.